Good afternoon, everyone. I guess we'll get started. Maybe some folks will roll in and catch up as we go along. My name is Mike Levoie. I'm the manager of the Cherokee Fisheries and Wildlife Program, and this is a program of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians responsible for the management and conservation of fish and wildlife resources, as well as their habitats. So I'd like to thank the museum for the opportunity to be here today and share with you some of our work and some of our projects and how we work to help the Cherokee community. We'd really like today to be informal. If you all have questions, please throw your hand in the air, and if we can clarify anything, that's great. We'll be kind of tag teaming this today. This is our program biologist, Caleb Hickman, and so we'll be going back and forth and talking about different things. We have some props up here to hopefully make things a bit more interesting. But anyway, we'll get started from there. So today we wanted to give you kind of an overview and some background as to why fish and wildlife resources and their habitats are really important to the Cherokee people and the Cherokee community. We'll talk about how our program has somewhat evolved over the years within the Cherokee government and what some of our responsibilities are today. And we'll illustrate in a bit more detail kind of how we meet our mission through describing some of the projects that we're currently involved with.
So a little bit of background. A lot of you may have seen this and may know quite a bit about the Cherokee's history. We got a good introduction, a couple of different talks before this, about the original land base. As you can see here, it's outlined in red. The original land base included up to 8 parts of 8 states, current day states, and was estimated somewhere over 400,000 square miles. That is an immense territory, isn't it? So with that land base comes a lot of different organisms, a lot of different habitats and environments. And the Cherokees lived throughout this area, living in the mountains, living in the lowlands, having fields, having lots of streams. So it was a very diverse place, and they lived in this area for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we know this, and they were closely tied to all of this environment. And it's very diverse. So, as you can see, over time, the different lines here mean different sessions where land was reduced. So there was a lot of encroachment by other people. Land was taken away. Treaties were signed. And one of the last ones was in the yellow area there. And that one was the last, that area right there was the last particular spot that Cherokees had inhabited before the forced removal. Okay, and I had family in the Tennessee part of that, back in that part of time, in the early 1800s. And they were forced to remove to Oklahoma, and that's where I'm from originally. That resulted in, later on, a division into 3 different tribes. So the Cherokee, there are 3 main tribes, and we've been learning about this today already. And where we're at, you can see the small dot there where it says present-day Cherokee Reservation, okay? So that's where we're at. It's a small area, it looks like on this map, compared to where it once was. That's over a 99% reduction in land base. So as I was talking about all of this close tie to the environment and all the different species, that could be lost with the reduction in land base. So present-day Cherokee environment looks something like this. This is in western North Carolina, and we call it the Keetoowah boundary. You can see it outlined in purple there. And we had other land bases throughout the area, but we have a major area where we do a lot of our work. And these areas are still very rich. We have over 56,000 acres. Over 80% of that is owned by the people, individual tribal members. So they can only give this land to other people that are tribal members. or sell it to other people that are tribal members. So it's held in trust by the government. But they own this land. They've actually paid for it, I think, more than once. It changes in elevation quite dramatically, and there's a lot of water there. So with all of this diversity, there is a lot of different species that people can still connect to. In fact, the Southern Appalachians is one of the most diverse, rich places on the continent. So fortunately for us, and for the tribe, they can still have a close connection to a lot of these organisms and a lot of the ecosystems that are here. And there's still a good population of people. I think there's somewhere around 13,000 members, but about 9,000, and I could be wrong, from what I understand, live on the boundary or within the boundary range. So, to talk about these ecosystems is pretty important. So, a Cherokee ecosystem is basically including all of the organisms within an area and their interactions with the system they're in, the non-living system as well, the air temperature, the water, the soil, how these organisms will influence all of that, and how it influences these organisms. So it's an interrelationship. That's an ecosystem. There's a nice little caricature here, a cartoon of what an ecosystem is and how a real basic way it works. But it includes all these organisms. So if the Cherokees were closely tied to all of these organisms, if we lose any of these, it could be very important. So over thousands of years of living within an environment where you might rely on a food source, where you might rely on something, a tool that you obtain from one of these organisms, and you lose one, that could be incredibly important. So we tried to conserve, and that's conservation, all the organisms we can in the ecosystem as a whole. So that's our main role here. So we call these aspects of what people might find important about the ecosystem a service. So it provides something for people in some way or form. And these can be called environmental or ecosystem services. One of the more important, and we can go down a list here that most people agree are important services. One is provisioning, and this can come in the form of fuel, such as firewood. So people need firewood, they always have. And also clean water. So in our area, clean water is particularly important. Regulating. A great example are bats. Cherokees really like bats. Bats are important. They're in stories, and they're in the language, but they also control disease through pest control. Bats are incredibly important because they consume a lot of insects. So that's a regulating factor. And we can also have climate and wastes and pests. So those are all important. Another service is supporting services. Supporting services come when organisms could support some activities like nutrient cycling. So the nutrients within the soil, there are organisms that will help cycle those nutrients. And they can move across systems to other organisms. And there's also things like pollination. Bees are incredibly important. And right now we have a decline in bees. So the tribe, if we find bees in this environment, it could be incredibly important to crops, for example. And one of the most popular ones that we would all think about the Cherokees would find important is culture. And culture is sort of intertwined with a lot of these others, but as you can see, there's a lot of different examples here with the species and the uses of them. There could be a subsistence, so people might rely on these organisms for food. They make art out of it. And also some organisms are tied to the language. We do actually have a program that Mike will talk about where there's education tied to bird identification in the Cherokee language. Aesthetics, medicine, recreation, and even view sheds, which is just how an area looks. Is it a beautiful spot? And if you've ever been to the Smokies, it's incredibly beautiful. It's a fantastic, breathtaking place that I think if you haven't seen it, you should really check it out. And also the economy. So The fishing industry is incredibly important to the tribe, and Mike will talk about that as well.
So Caleb pretty clearly illustrated why conserving intact ecosystems and biotic community. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if the Cherokee Nation interacts with other, not necessarily government, but agencies that work conserving the local areas and stuff. Like I belong to the Nature Conservancy,
Mm-hmm.
local land in my area preserved for future.
Yeah.
Cherokee Nation in your area.
That's a great question, and we definitely focus on partnerships to meet our long-term needs. We can't do it alone as a small agency, and as you know, wildlife and environmental issues cross political boundaries, so we work with nonprofits, other government agencies, education institutions to make sure we can partner and meet our sovereign objectives, but also meet larger landscape scale conservation issues. So that's a big priority for us. So as Caleb mentioned, we have all these intact services that are so important for the human community, the Cherokee human community. So why are we concerned that we have to do something as both a government and a community? Shouldn't these just persist over the long term? Well, actually, we're in a time period now that we're facing really extreme threats and challenges to conserve fish and wildlife populations. And some scientists even believe we're in a phase of a sixth extinction where we're losing so many species right now that it's one of the largest extinction events in actually the history of the planet. So it's a really challenging time. So human growth has really resulted in a lot of habitat loss. Cities are building. When you develop an area and you put down more pavement and more houses, you change the way water flows over the landscape, and that impacts streams. You have pollution issues. Invasive species are continually an issue. We've got things coming in from all over the world that have never been a part of these natural ecosystems that are really wreaking havoc on a lot of communities. Disease is a huge one right now. Particularly this photo shows a diseased bat. White nose syndrome is a disease that's killing millions of bats throughout the eastern United States, which is a really scary situation with how important they are to regulating ecosystems. And then, the big looming one is climate change. We're all concerned of how that may impact the functioning of these natural systems. So our goal as a government resource management entity is to understand these threats, understand how they're impacting our natural systems, and work to both protect and enhance what we have to mitigate these threats. So that said, I'm going to get into a little bit of history about the Cherokee government and how our role as a resource agency has evolved through the years. As most of you are familiar, I'm kind of starting in the 1800s here. At that time, Cherokee community in the Southern Appalachians was an agricultural-based society that was also supplemented from hunting and fishing resources, as well as gathering resources. So they obviously lived very closely with the environment in the Southern Appalachians, and also practiced a variety of traditional management actions during that time. Prescribed fire, the use of fire to change the environment, whether to increase game or possibly control pests or improve visibility in the forest, was a really important traditional tool used by the tribe for centuries. Kind of jumping back up to the 1900s, during this period throughout the country, not just in the Southern Appalachians, but because of industrial growth and population growth, the landscape really faced a lot of environmental degradation. Particularly in the Southern Appalachians, where the Eastern Band of Cherokee are, massive logging occurred in the area, and that consisted of clear cuts that led to sediment runoff, which polluted streams, and it had some major landscape scale impacts that impacted Cherokee quality of life. One tree in particular, the American chestnut, was abundant throughout the area and provided such an incredible source of food for both Cherokee people and wildlife that the loss of this tree due to a disease during that time vastly changed the ecosystem. So we're still understanding those impacts to today. And then other sources of pollution, environmental degradation related to industrial growth, more outside of the present-day Qualla boundary, definitely impacted the resources in the area and impacted the Cherokee people. Particularly in our area, we have a few paper mills that have had some long-lasting effects on aquatic resources. So jump into the 60s, it was about this time that the Cherokee tribal government really took a proactive stance on wanting to manage their natural resources. Up until that time, there wasn't much of a cohesive, scientifically based management system for conserving resources for future generations. So in 1964, the tribe partnered with then the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries to institute a recreational fishing program at Cherokee. And this was both to help tribal members, but also to increase tourist revenue coming from the area. So that has been a tremendously successful project that I'll get into more. But that was really the tribe's kind of first government jump into managing their resources. So during this time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal agency that has some regulatory authority over tribal interests, really was the entity responsible for managing tribal forests. And there wasn't a whole lot of resources available to effectively manage tribal resources like forest. In the 70s, the BIA finally began to appropriate some monies towards doing timber stand assessments and planning some more progressive management of the forests. But at that time, there really wasn't a lot of funding to support any kind of substantial improvements on the landscape. And during that time, the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, the tribal government became very proactive in terms of enacting legislation and policy that really voiced some concern for protecting natural resources in general, as well as fish and wildlife. So hunting laws were enacted, protections were put in place for stream development, a variety of different policies were instituted by the tribal government during that time. And up until 96, there was quite a significant change in operations for the tribal government, where they first established their Office of Environment and Natural Resources. And this program was mainly supported by some federal granting monies through the Environmental Protection Agency. This program still exists and is a critical partner for our organization and us continuing to meet our goals. Kind of jumping to 2001 was the first time the tribe developed a forest management plan with the assistance of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that development also led to some increased regulatory issues for both the tribal government and tribal members, particularly related to endangered species on tribal lands. 2006 was a great time for natural resources for the tribe, as Principal Chief Michelle Hicks instituted an environmental proclamation. And this document really helped the tribe to move in a new direction in terms of valuing resource conservation. So it focused on sustainable development, protecting wildlife resources, partnering with other folks who had similar goals and objectives that the tribe did, and also instituting some longer-term planning into natural resource conservation for the tribe. In 2008, 2008 was the first year that the tribe, outside of the fishing program, developed a more comprehensive fish and wildlife management entity, which is now Cherokee Fisheries and Wildlife, our program that we're representing today. It was the first time that the tribe hired biological staff to conduct inventories and understand what resources were really available on the modern-day Cherokee landscape. In 2013, we had another tremendous leap forward in terms of how the tribe views natural resource management. And this was the finalization of a long-term project called the Legacy Plan. And this plan involved communication between resource management professionals, the Cherokee community, and as well as historic professionals within the tribe. And our goal that was met with the publication of that document was to integrate the community's historic and modern day values and vision for the environment, and translate that into a working document that the tribal government could then implement to move the tribe forward into the future to conserve their resources for future generations. So today, we've continued to expand as a program. We've got some interesting restoration and research initiatives, and we've also continued to develop our fisheries program, which has become a huge economic engine for the tribe. And from there, we'd like to kind of jump into, here's somewhat of a summary of what our mission is today. As I mentioned, our program was formed in 2008, so we do quite a bit of work with our fisheries program, inventory and monitoring work, as I mentioned, restoration and research, as well as outreach with the public today. So with that, I'd like to go into some more detail about actual projects that we're working on that meet our goals and objectives in terms of sustaining environmental resources for the benefit of the economy, for the environment, as well as community cultural needs. So fisheries resources in the Southern Appalachians in particular are extremely diverse. It's truly the most diverse temperate fisheries resource in all throughout North America. So all these fish that were found in this area were really critically important to the Cherokee culture. They were a huge food source. They provided recreational opportunities for tribal members. You find fishes in art and language, and they're truly just an integral part of who the Cherokee people are. So our goal really is to understand this resource and manage it for the benefit of tribal members, as well as the greater conservation community. So we do a variety of different things. Understanding what fish are in an area are really important to understanding how water is maintained and kept clean. So we do quite a bit of inventory and monitoring work to monitor a biological community that then tells us about the health of the entire aquatic ecosystem. And we're also really focused on native species restoration, particularly species that are culturally significant to the Eastern Band of Cherokee. A couple different projects that we've been focusing on of late. This photo here of the large fish on the bottom left is a picture of a sickle-fin red horse. And this is a large-bodied sucker that has been historically a really significant food source for the Cherokee people. The tribe, historically, Cherokee built rock fish weirs throughout different river systems that were often located next to villages, and these fish weirs allowed tribal people to fish and collect large amounts of fish protein during certain spawning times of the year for fish, such as this red horse. So we're working with all these partners you see on the left to both restore this culturally significant fish, but it's also a very rare fish and faces listing on the Endangered Species Act. So we work with partners to propagate this fish, so we collect wild brood stock from rivers. We then spawn eggs and then raise juveniles to release back into our river systems in hopes of one day sustaining a larger population that could then be harvested. We're also involved in some detailed research too. The picture in the middle right shows a joint project between our program and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in that photo, we're implanting radio transmitters inside the body cavity of a fish. So we actually perform a surgery right alongside the river, implant a very tiny transmitter into the fish, and then next to me here we have a radio antenna that we can then follow the fish, and we can understand how a fish moves through the system, what kind of habitats it uses, how long it survives. And all those questions are really help inform us how we can adaptively respond and hopefully restore the species in the long run. We're also focused, in the bottom right, is a native brook trout. Brook trout are our only native fish in the East. A lot of folks, I'm sure, are familiar with rainbow and brown trout, but brook trout are our only native trout here. And they've been eliminated from almost 80% of their historic range. So this is truly a heritage species for the tribe, and we're working to restore this fish as well. So we monitor this fish and work to improve habitat, such as the project in the middle here. It shows a stream restoration project where we're diverting pollution away from a brook trout stream. So these along with habitat work, other habitat work, and other regulatory oversight help us move forward in meeting our fish restoration objectives.
Another good example are bats. So I've already brought up bats a little bit and their importance to the tribe. Another aspect about them that I also brought up was pest reduction. To get into a little bit more specifics about that, a single bat in one day can consume over 1,000 insects, about the size of a mosquito. So that is dramatic, especially if you can have thousands of bats. So a lot of people might find it important to have bats around. They're important for crops, and especially for pests that can affect crops, but also disease. And they're responsible, from some calculations that people have done, for over $1 billion. So if you're worried about the economy at all, they could be important. But there are some threats to these organisms. One of the main threats is the white nose syndrome. Also, there's influences to their habitat. The white nose syndrome is a fungus that attacks them. And we found out throughout the eastern United States that there are populations that are dramatically declining. And luckily, we have been collecting data on bats since 2004. And this has allowed us to get a snapshot between when this fungus arrived, before and after. And also, we're using a lot of different techniques to monitor them. And we've developed programs working with a lot of partners, both federal partners and state and local partners. And a lot of these techniques require effort that needs collaborations and to understand the population dynamics. So the bats their populations can change dramatically over a spatial scale. So our data set has been really critical in the government in figuring out exactly what's going on. And they're still trying to understand this. So we actually do have one endangered species, the Indiana bat, that's been found on our land. So the federal influence is there based on the Endangered Species Act. So have any of you seen bats? I'm sure you have. So people have seen bats. But they are a mammal. So just so you know, they're not a bird. A lot of people make that mistake. And it's understandable because there's not a lot of mammals that fly. Does anybody know how they get around at night? They've got these little tiny eyes. They can see. You've heard blind as a bat before, but they can see. Does anybody know? Have any ideas? What's that? Sonar. And a sort of sonar, yes. So they make these noises, right? And it bounces off things like sonar. We call it echolocation, okay? So they can go through their environment. If you watch them, they're amazing animals. They can sort of dance around trees. They can go in between little limbs. And if you've ever been where we're at, it's really dense foliage there. So bats can move around through that, and it's amazing that they can do it just by making these clicking noises. Okay, they make these clicking noises, and they've got really good hearing. You can see their ears are very large, right? And you notice the differences in their faces and the way they look. That means their sounds have to be different as well. They receive that differently. And because of that, we can use a detector. And so here is what we call a bat detector. So this allows us to capture that sound wave that comes in their environment when they're making those noises. And because of the different sizes and different shapes of the animals, there is a different sound usually for a different species. So we can actually figure out what species is around a lot of times. And so we work with our partners. We collect data using these devices like this. We also set up these enormous nets sometimes, and they act like curtains. And we'll put them in a corridor area where there's a stream, a small creek, even a road. Right now, they work really well, and bats are sort of funneled through there. You know, they will go through paths of least resistance, and we'll set up a nice curtain-like net with fine mesh in it. And what we hope is that when they send their signal out, they'll miss it. And a lot of times they do. This net works like that, and they'll fly into it. And we'll bring down the curtain, catch them. And what you see here are people holding the bats, and these are pictures usually after what we call mist netting. So there's a mist net. So, and then we can record a lot of other data about reproduction. So if reproduction is a problem in this population, we could figure that out. Also species diversity. We can understand how many species there are. And we found 11 different species of bats where we're at, which is a very diverse area. So we have a lot of data, we have a lot of bats, and we have a good timeline to understand what's going on. And we also want to report this to the public. So we try to interact with people about bats and bat conservation as well. So.
Another aspect and focal group of animals that we work with are birds, particularly songbirds. And we do this through a variety of partners that enhance our program's small capacity to do a lot of work on our own. So we have nonprofit partners as well as government partners that help us perform some surveys on tribal lands to really help us understand long-term trends in bird populations. And how birds and habitat are changing together throughout the landscape. One really interesting program that we're working on with both our resource management partners but also our cultural partners is a bird netting program, a mist netting program, which is taking place at the tribe's Cowie Mound property. And this property is along the Little Tennessee River, and it's an extremely important property for the tribe. It was a historic commercial and a government center for the tribe. And this property is tremendously important for both tribal culture as well as conservation in the area. So we go out and work with our partners to net birds in this area. And we also involve the Cherokee community. So school groups come out, particularly the language programs that are carried out during the summer. And we also make sure we include native language speakers to interact with these kids. So we bring out folks, net birds, and then talk about birds through Cherokee native language. So these partners are tremendously helpful in both helping us meet conservation objectives in terms of understanding these resources, but also connecting the Cherokee community to the cultural value behind understanding these resources, particularly related to how birds and language are associated. So part of this project, our partners with our assistance helped develop a Birds of Cowetown book, all written in Cherokee language. So this is a project that would help develop curriculum for a third grade class in our native language school that exists in the Eastern Band right now.
Okay, this brings us to another great example, and that's the whitetailed deer. A lot of you have seen whitetailed deer, I'm sure, if you live around here or in the eastern United States, midwestern United States. They are pretty numerous, but strange enough, where we're at, they're not all that numerous, despite the use of the fur trade in the 1700s and 1800s. So we have started a restoration project dealing with whitetailed deer. And they're particularly important to the tribe. There is, out of the 7 clans, you may have learned this by now, there is the Deer Clan, which is incredibly important. And where we're at in Cherokee, there's a lot of people that are part of the Deer Clan. And it is kind of sad that there's not a lot of deer around for people to be a part of, to be a part of the lives of the deer. So there is no hunting of deer on the tribal reservation, and there is no, there's not a lot of activity around studying them until we started this in western North Carolina. So we've been working with a lot of partners. As you can see here, the state of North Carolina, the national park, who's our neighbor and could be a refuge for deer as well, are all interested. And we obtained some deer from the North Carolina state parks. So this deer project has been a very intensive kind of study and collaborations. We've had a lot of different people involved in this. The state vet is there. You can see a couple of us in the picture. So we would go to the state park about 4 hours away to the east where the deer populations are really large. And we'd work with these collaborators to dart the deer and put them temporarily, in a sleep phase, and then we would put them in a crate like this one on the bottom right, and we would travel with them back to the Cherokee and release them into a soft release pen so that they could acclimate to the environment where we're at in a higher elevation in a mountainous area. So this is what we would call a population augmentation. And that's important for any sort of restoration project. You want to bring in some of the organisms. Then you want to study them. And the reason you want to study them is, and this is the research part of it, is if you don't find that the populations have grown and there's not more animals, you have to try to figure out why. And so in our area, there has been at least 12 different efforts where they have tried to augment the population by bringing animals in, but nobody's studied it. So one thing we are taking the lead on is the research side of that. I'm an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Tennessee, and we brought a graduate student on board that I'm mentoring and we're funding to lead the research on this part of it. And what he's going to do is figure out the baseline effects. So what's going on with the population? Is it growing or declining? Then after that, we can start asking questions of why, because it's really hard to figure out exactly why until you study that as well. We'll look at the habitat, try to figure out if it's something different about the habitat that's changed over the years. Is it something about their food source within the habitat? A lot of people live there. Is it something about the people? Is it something about the environment in some way, or predators that could be affecting them? So there's a lot of different ideas. So we do manage the habitat to go along with this. We've created what we call wildlife openings, and they're multi-species use openings. So there are birds that can use it, flying squirrels that are really important in these areas, but deer are particularly important, and they could use it. So one day we hope that we could, in fact, have a hunting season. That is really a goal, but it could be way down the road. And it seems like a lot of the people in the area understand that. They understand that we have to have a population. And right now, a lot of people that I talk to, they have to travel to other states to hunt deer. They own a cabin somewhere else and land somewhere else just so they can hunt deer and be a part of that part of the tribe tradition. So, and there is outreach involved with this. So the Deer Project, in particular, we put ads in the newspaper asking if people have seen our tagged deer. So one other aspect about this that we do with the research is we're putting collars on the deer like this. And we can determine locations of the deer generally, but sometimes they get away from us and we need the public's help. This is a GPS collar. It's also what's called a VHF collar, so there is a signal like Mike was talking about with the antenna that you can detect and go figure out where the animal's at. But some of the places these animals go are pretty remote. So the GPS collar, what it does, it's a global positioning system, just like your phone would. It sends a signal up to a satellite, and then that satellite can then communicate with cell phones or computers and tell you a location the animal has been. So that helps. But other observational stuff that people can help us with are if the animals are around other deer, what they were doing behaviorally. Were they eating something strange, or what were they up to? Were they interacting with dogs? So these are things that have become helpful for us to understand. And so we're calling this citizen science a Keetoowah ecology. And for those of you that know the word Keetoowah, you know that it means community effort. So in the Cherokee language, it was important in describing collaborative efforts in a community to make a garden, build a house. So you're in a Keetoowah. So we called this Keetoowah ecology for our citizen science effort, so that everybody is participating and helping us collect data and understand what's going on. And we're implementing this idea with other projects as well. Wild turkey surveys, so people can tell us where they've seen turkey and other organisms. And we hope to expand that into other projects. Another one of our outreach objectives is the living with wildlife. Where we're at, there are some large animals. You want to hold this up for me? So one of the first examples here are elk. And so what Mike is holding up here are elk antlers. Those are real. They get to be close to 4 feet long and can weigh over 40 pounds. And they grow really fast. They're one of the fastest growing organs out of animals that animals can create. They're made of bone, but they do fall off eventually, just like deer. So elk are a deer. They're just a different species and larger. And elk did exist in that area, but over a couple hundred years ago. So there's nobody alive that had interacted with elk. So no Cherokees that in that area can tell us what they did. And when an elk got in their garden, for example. So one of the issues are nuisance issues. So elk do get into gardens. They're large animals. They can destroy a garden. So one of the things we're doing is trying to understand how people can live with these animals that they once lived with. They were part of the Cherokee culture once upon a time. So we build fences for people. We show them how we would build a fence to prevent elk from coming in. But we also trade information, and that comes with any of these projects. There's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge out there that I think is really important. And I've done a lot of work in this field, and I learn stuff from people all the time. So we hope that maybe they'll come up with something, or there's something that was passed on by word of mouth that may have survived, and we can learn how to live with these organisms. And another example, living with wildlife, is more of a positive perspective, and that's with bats. So we've talked about bats already, how important they are, and the community knows that. We're helping build bats and showing people how to build them, and build bat houses, I'm sorry. And this is a bat house, so there's these small little cracks that bats can go live in, especially if their habitat has been affected in any way. And people want them around their house. If you don't like mosquitoes or something, you might want a few bat houses. So we found that to be pretty appealing to people.
So a couple other outreach initiatives that I'll just touch on briefly. As I mentioned, there's a photo of the language book that we helped develop, and we're also trying to engage kind of in a larger framework with our Tribal Historic Preservation Office to really do a better job at linking culture and conservation. So we've worked with them to hire on actually a curriculum developer that focuses both on culture and wildlife issues, and integrate those types of lessons and lesson plans into the school system. So it's an important goal for us to get down to the children who will be responsible for protecting these resources in the long run, and show them the value of why it's important. Another really fun focus that we have is getting kids in the streams. There's so many beautiful, pristine streams that run through the Smoky Mountains that harbor this incredibly beautiful diversity of fish that a lot of folks don't know about. So simply getting kids out in a wetsuit and a snorkel and sticking their heads underwater really opens up a real new world and a whole new appreciation for what's out there. Some of the fish we have are as beautiful as fish you see in coral reefs, but people don't know about it if they don't get out and look. So we get fish outside, or kids outside, to have fun. One project that we're really excited about to be continuing again this year is a fish weir reenactment. So I think I mentioned fish weirs. They were large stone structures in rivers that help capture fish. So some of these ancient weirs still exist in our streams throughout the southern Appalachians. So there's remnants in the form of rocks that are V-shaped that are actually these archaeological resources for us to bring back to life, so to speak. So we get out in the river with kids, and we've got a couple dozen kids trying to funnel fish through this weir into a fish trap. And associated with that, we have a lot going on along the stream bank in terms of aquatic education related to fish and bugs, and as well as history relating to fish weirs. So we're really trying to work hard to integrate both the cultural relevancy of why it's important to conserve these resources and how Cherokee has always been connected to these aquatic resources. The last topic that we're going to hit on in terms of why preserving wildlife and managing wildlife is important goes down to the economy. The Cherokee economy is heavily influenced by our fishing program. It's estimated that it's likely the second biggest draw to the town of Cherokee. And last year we sold over 50,000 licenses. So we have folks coming in from every state in the country to fish for trout at Cherokee. And this provides a huge economic benefit to our program. It supports what we do to produce the fish, as well as other staff that are able to go out and work to conserve other resources. But it also has tremendous secondary impacts to the economy. So everybody that's coming to fish at Cherokee, staying in a hotel and getting gas and providing levy to the tribe. So it's a really important economic engine. And sustaining that resource, it's critical for us to sustain good water and clean water. So that economy, the economy is critically linked to conservation in that way. As Caleb mentioned, we've got elk abound now in downtown Cherokee, which can be exciting and frustrating at the same time. But wildlife viewing is a really important resource that is growing every year in Cherokee. Besides elk, there's really great bird viewing and bird watching opportunities, and all these different opportunities can really bring a tremendous resource to the tribal economy. So with that, I'd really just like to thank you all for coming out and spending some time with us. I hope we were able to provide something interesting, and we'd like to take any questions that you all have. Yes, sir. Well, that's
his question.
What's that?
Restate his question.
So the question was, just to restate it, how do we, as a conservation community, combat a fungal disease that infects bats, and this infects bats in their cave environment? So, so just to clarify, so bats develop this disease while they're hibernating in caves. So bats often hibernate in caves in the winter, and then during the times of the year when insects are abundant, they'll be out on the landscape, and they often then will roost in trees, under bark, or in hollowed out cavities. So during this hibernation period, it's a really critical time for them in terms of conserving resources. And when they develop this fungal infection, it causes them to arouse and deplete resources and become dehydrated, and eventually the fungus can penetrate their skin and kill the bat. So that said, caves are really complex environments, and going in and treating a fungal infection with a fungicide or something like that could have really cascading impacts to other elements of the cave community itself. And doing that kind of treatment on a landscape level is really somewhat insurmountable. But that said, there are a lot of experts out there, a lot more specialized than we are, that are focusing on this issue and looking at specific ways to mitigate this. There's been some work in actually developing artificial cave habitats, which maintain the same structure and complexity that a natural cave would, but when the bats leave, because they don't have this other complex biotic community, folks could then clean it out and decontaminate it. So there's a lot going on in that world to try to combat that issue.
You got it. Yeah, those are seasonal. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Some bats do hibernate in houses and other wooden structures, but these houses that are on the trees, basically made to represent bark that maybe is flapped off of the tree. So they form these, inside the boxes are these tight cavities where bats can crawl up and, yeah.
Yeah, bats generally like, and it's hard to think this way because we usually cut down dead or dying trees, but bats usually like those with the bark sloughing off. You've seen them, and but so they can get up underneath. And so that's really what you're simulating, especially if you're cutting down those trees. If you think they could, hit your house or something. So it's a good, it's a way to supplement that in some way.
Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was regarding this fish on the bottom left, the sicklefin red horse. And this fish has now really only occupies about 50 to 60% of its historic habitat. And a lot of that is due to a variety of factors, but one big one is all of the dams that are throughout the southeast right now. So dams and the impoundments that they've caused have had altered habitat, as well as fragmented habitat. So dams prohibit fish from moving in natural patterns that they once would. And dams also alter water flow patterns and water temperature patterns that can then have secondary impacts on things such as reproduction. But then outside of dams, we also have other general habitat degradation issues like pollution or that sort of thing that's impacted them.
Any other questions? Anybody? Well, thank you very much, and you can contact us. Sorry, go to the last slide. At our email, if you have any other questions, we'd be happy to answer any more that you have. Sorry, the wrong way. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. And somehow it just skipped